Hey everybody, Billy Obenauer here, continuing our work in Noe and Colleagues Fundamentals of Human Resource Management textbook. In this lesson, we're going to be covering Chapter 5, Planning for and Recruiting Human Resources. And this is a critical topic in human resource management because if you plan poorly and you have too many people in your organization, you're going to have to make cuts, and that's going to impact the culture of your organization. It's going to impact your ability to retain top talent. But if you plan poorly or recruit poorly and you don't have enough people, you're not going to be able to operate your business effectively. Okay, so your ability to plan for and recruit human resources is going to be critical to your ability to run an effective organization. That said, let's get started. Now, effective HR planning is going to position you to meet your business objectives because good planning is going to help you make sure you have the right people in the right positions to be successful. Okay, it also is going to involve comparing what you have in the organization currently with what you're going to need in the future, and then figuring out what changes you need to make in order to meet your future goals. All right, planning is going to involve three different stages that we're going to break down in more details. The first stage being forecasting, second stage being goal setting and strategic planning, and the final stage being program implementation and evaluation. Now, forecasting is the first step in the planning process. And when you first heard the term forecasting in your life, you probably were looking at a weather forecast. Okay, and a weather forecast, even though it's a completely different area, is not all that different from the type of forecasting that we're talking about. Okay, just like a meteorologist will use data from what's happening in the atmosphere in a specific geographic region to try to predict what's going to happen in the future, human resource managers use different sets of data to try to predict what their labor demands and their labor supply are going to be in the future. Okay, so as we're forecasting in HR, the first thing we're going to do is try to forecast what our demand is going to be. Okay, so how many people are we going to need in different positions? Okay, then we're going to try to determine what our labor supply is going to be. Okay, so we'll look at what our labor supply is today, and then using data that we have, predict what that labor supply is going to look like in the future. And then what we're going to do is we're going to subtract that supply from the predicted demand, and we're going to figure out if we have a surplus or a shortage. Now this here is an overview of the human resource planning process. All right, and everything that's inside of this red circle that I'm drawing right now is the first step or the first stage in the process, what we refer to as forecasting. All right, and as you can see on this model, how we forecast is going to impact the second stage because it's going to impact how we plan. Okay, and then that's going to impact how we implement our plan. So recognizing that stage one is going to impact stage two and then stage three, it's very important that we have a good, strong understanding of forecasting. So we're going to break down forecasting in a little more detail. An important tool that we're going to use in forecasting our labor demand is called a trend analysis. And what we're doing with the trend analysis is we're using statistical models and statistical techniques to predict labor demand for the next year based upon objective statistics or existing quantitative data. Okay, and these objective statistics are often referred to as leading indicators. All right, and some examples of what leading indicators might look like first would be a measure of the economy. Okay, so what do we mean by a measure of the economy? Well, if the economy is doing well and consumers have more money and they have more disposable income at their hands, that's going to impact different types of sales. That's going to impact our labor demands. Okay, we're going to think about actions of competitors. Okay, so I came from the building trades industry, and imagine you're running a Home Depot and then a Lowe's moves in next door. Well, when Lowe's moves in next door, obviously they're going to take some of your sales away because now you have a new competitor right next door to you. And when you lose those sales, you're not going to have the same labor demands that you had previously. Okay, we'll look at changes in technology, and there's a variety of different changes in technology that we see in the workplace. So we've seen things like self-checkout kiosks that have reduced demand for cashiers. We've seen different ways that freight teams are using technology in receiving that has reduced the need for people on freight teams. We've seen different ways that warehouses are running with automation that changes what we need in warehouses. So all these changes in technology are going to impact our labor demands. And then we also have different workforce trends that we have to consider in our labor forecast as well. So let's think about what these objective statistics look like in real life. All right, and I want you to think about if you were forecasting labor demand for a retail store, what statistical factors might you consider? Well, you might look at your previous year's sales. You might look at things like your current sales growth or decline compared to the previous year. You might look at local economic indicators. All right, so if a large major employer in your local area has a layoff, that's going to probably impact you. You might look at different types of weather trends. You might look at logistical issues. Okay, if you can't get product into your retail store, that's probably going to impact how you need to staff the retail store and so on and so forth. But these are just some examples of what some of these leading indicators might look like. Now, as we gather this objective data that we're going to use for our labor demand forecast, we need to recognize that garbage into these forecasts is going to lead to garbage out in terms of our goal setting, strategic planning, and program implementation. And this is critical to recognize because sometimes managers are actually motivated to put garbage into their labor demand forecast. And we're going to talk about that next. Now, as we think about why managers might be motivated to put garbage into their labor demand forecast, let's go back to our retail store example. And I want you to think about if you were running a retail store, you were working in a retail store, if a customer came in to look for a product that you had in stock and on the shelf, what type of work might that involve for you? Okay, so if your product is properly stocked, the customer might not need any help. All right, they might just go grab the product off the shelf, go check out, use a self-checkout kiosk. They may never actually interact with another human being. All right, you may show the customer the product. They may come in and say, hey, do you know where this is? And you might show them where it is or tell them where it is, and then they get it and go through kind of that same process that we just talked about. Or you may ring up the sale. Okay, so maybe the customer goes and gets the product off the shelf, okay, and then they bring it to the register, and then an employee rings them up for the sale. Okay, either way, no matter which path we go down here, there's really not going to be too much labor demand from interacting directly with that customer. Now, let's go back to that same example, and let's imagine the customer came in looking for a product and you were out of stock. You didn't have it on the shelf. And think about what type of work that might involve for you. Well, for starters, when the customer says they're looking for the product, you're probably going to start by looking in your computer system and seeing if it says you have the product. Okay, and if it says you do have the product, then you're probably going to go physically look for it. You're going to go look on the shelf. You're going to look, maybe there's multiple shelf spaces where that product could be that you're going to have to check. Maybe you have some storage areas that you're going to have to check. Or maybe your computer system said you don't have the product, in which case you might check your order delivery dates, all right, see when the product might be coming in. You may even call and check on an order. All right, you also might look to see if other local stores have it. Okay, stores within your company. You might look at their inventory and you might even call them and ask them to double check if they have it or not. You may show the customer some alternative products. All right, so you may not have the product they're looking for, but you might have something else that would meet their needs, and you're going to spend some time talking to them about that and explaining that to them. All right, you also might look at some options for ordering online. Maybe your company has a website that the customer can order the product through. And then finally, you might just recommend some competitors. So if you can't meet the customer's needs with what you have in your store, you might talk to them about some other local stores that could meet their needs and try to help them out that way. Okay, but whichever pathways we go down here, we can tell that when we don't have this product in the store, when we're out of stock on this product, it's actually going to create a lot more work for us to try to meet a customer's needs than if we just had the product in stock. Now, we've already discussed that if we're understaffed, we're not going to be as effective running our businesses, which basically means that we're going to be at greater risk of having the types of out of stocks that we just described on the previous slide. All right, so I want you to think about this, and if you were an operational manager, how might what we discussed on these last few questions influence your labor forecasting? Well, you're not going to want to have a labor shortage because you recognize that if you have a labor shortage, that you're potentially going to have inventory issues. You're going to have more out of stocks. These out of stocks are not only going to cost you sales, but they're going to create more work for you. Okay, so you've already got a shortage. Now we've created more work, which basically exasperates the impacts of the shortage. Okay, and it builds us into basically an unhealthy cycle here in terms of staffing. right? So managers recognize this, so they have some motivation to forecast in such a way that they're not going to have labor shortages. Building on this idea that managers are motivated to make sure that they're not understaffed, we have to recognize that if managers don't trust their forecasting system, they are going to manipulate the data that goes into that system to ensure that they get the staffing that they need. And I saw this firsthand when I was in industry. Okay, my company had a forecasting system where if you put your sales in and forecasted your sales accurately, what happened was you were short-staffed every single time. So managers started manipulating their forecasted sales in order to get the forecasted labor that they believed they needed to run their businesses. Now, once we've forecasted our labor demand, we need to work on forecasting our labor supply. And one of the tools that we're going to use to do this is called a transitional matrix. Okay, now I left the definition from your textbook on this slide here because if you're using the book, you are going to see this definition, but this definition is actually a little bit misleading. All right, I really want you to think about transitional matrix as being a chart that deals with probabilities. All right, so the transitional matrix is going to show you the likelihood that a person in a certain position is going to be in a certain position in 3 years. Okay, it's going to show you the likelihood that a person in a position 3 years from now is going to come from a specific place. All right, so it's going to address two different questions essentially. Where are people in each job category today likely to go? And where are people in each job category in the future likely to have come from? To better understand the transitional matrix, let's take a look at one and work with it a little bit. Okay, now as we look at this, I want you to remember these are not perfect estimates that we're going to look at in a transitional matrix, and I'll explain why kind of at the end of discussing this here. Okay, but basically what we have is we have what we'll call our current time, 2015, and our future time, 2018. And then we have a list of 8 different roles or positions. So we've got a sales manager, a sales representative, a sales apprentice, an assistant plant manager, a production assembler, a clerical position, and not in the organization. Okay, and these values that we have in 2015 correspond with numbers that we have over here for 2018. So you see 1 and 1, we've got 2 and 2, so 1 over here is the sales manager, 2 over here is the sales representative, and so on and so forth. Okay, now if we were to follow the chart here today, if we were looking at sales apprentices in 2015, if we follow this over to column 2, we have a value of 0.20. And what that means is it means there is a 20% chance that a sales apprentice in 2015 will become a sales representative in 2018. And it also means that there is a 20% chance that a sales representative in 2018 will have been a sales apprentice in 2015. So it helps us kind of answer the question of where are people likely to go and where are people likely to have come from, which helps us in forecasting our labor supply. Okay, now the challenge here that we have with the transitional matrix is that these estimates, again, are not going to be perfect. Okay, this idea of having a 0.20 or a 20% probability in one case and a 20% probability in the other case only really works if the total headcount for sales apprentice in 2015 is equal to the total headcount of sales representatives in 2018, which is really unlikely to be the case. So we need to recognize that these numbers are imperfect and that as we're making estimates based upon the transitional matrix, we're going to have to make decisions about how we want to use these estimates. Now, once we've forecasted our labor demand and forecasted our labor supply, we can forecast our labor surplus or shortage. All right, so in the example that I've got for you here, we have a forecasted labor demand of 1,200 hours. Okay, but we only have a forecasted labor supply of 900 hours. So when we subtract that forecasted demand from the forecasted supply, you can see we have a forecasted shortage of 300 hours. All right, in the second example, we have a forecasted demand of 1,100 hours and a forecasted supply of 1,250 hours. In this case, we have a forecasted surplus of 150 hours. Okay, so essentially what we're able to do here is we're able to identify these forecasted shortages and forecasted surpluses so that we can plan for how we're going to address them. Now, once we've determined that there's going to be a labor surplus forecasted, we can look at a variety of different ways for addressing that surplus. Okay, and the strategies that we choose are going to depend upon the speed of the results that we need and how much we want to prioritize the well-being of our employees. Okay, so if we are not all too concerned with the well-being of our employees, but we need fast results, we would look at these top three options here. Okay, the first one being downsizing, which would be essentially removing employees from the organization, and then the second two being pay reductions and demotions. And these two aren't necessarily going to remove people from the organization, but they're going to lower what we pay our employees, and they also are potentially going to motivate people to resign from the organization. All right, if we need fast results, but we do care a little more about our employees' well-being, we may look at transfers and work sharing. Now, transfers essentially are moving people to areas in the organization where we may not have the same type of surplus, and they do cause some suffering for employees, but a lesser level of suffering than downsizing and pay reductions and so on. Okay, now work sharing is really a fancy term for saying cutting hours. Okay, because what we're doing when we're work sharing is rather than eliminating positions, we're eliminating hours for multiple employees and having them share their work. Okay. Now, finally, if we have more time, if we forecast it out a little bit further, then we can really reduce the impact on our employees, and we can use one of these four strategies here. We have hiring freezes, natural attrition, early retirement, and retraining. Now, hiring freezes and natural attrition are really related here, okay, because what we're looking at is we're recognizing that employees are going to leave the organization naturally. Okay, this happens all the time at just about every organization. And what we're saying we're going to do is as people leave the organization, we're not necessarily going to replace them. Okay, so we're going to deal with our surplus in that manner. With an early retirement strategy, what we would do typically is offer an incentive to employees who are close to retirement to retire a little bit earlier than planned. And with retraining, what we would look to do is we would look to potentially transfer someone, but give them more time to become ready for that position and then transfer to something that they're comfortable with. Now, alternatively, we may have forecasted a labor shortage, in which case we're going to have to consider, again, how fast do we need results? Okay, but this time, instead of worrying about the impact on employees, we're going to think about how much do we want to be able to change later. All right, now the challenge here with a shortage is we don't want to adjust in response to a shortage in such a way that it causes us to have a surplus later on. So we got to be careful about that. Okay, now if we need fast results, there are three options here that we're really going to look at. Okay, the first one being overtime pay. Okay, and if we are paying overtime, basically what we're doing is we're saying we have employees who are currently working 40 hours a week. We're going to ask them to work 45 or 50, and they're going to get overtime pay for doing that. And we have the ability to change that later. The ability to change is pretty high on that because we can just reduce the overtime later on. Okay, we could hire temporary employees. That's also fast. And because they're temporary, the ability to change is also high. All right, the challenge with hiring temporary employees obviously is we're going to have them for a short period of time, but we do have to invest in training them. Okay, we also can outsource different functions. Okay, meaning basically, as we discussed in previous units, what we're going to do is we're going to hire another organization to take care of this function. Okay, and that can be fast as well. And because we can bring those services back in-house when we have the capacity to do it, the ability to change is fairly high. Okay. Now, if we have a little more time on our hands, we can use retrain transfers. Okay, now that's going to be a little bit slower because we have to train employees in other areas. Okay, and we do still have ability to change later though when we do this because these are employees who are now trained on a variety of different positions, so we can transfer them again if we need to later on. All right, we can count on turnover reductions, basically try to retain more people. Again, that's going to be slow. All right, our ability to change is a little bit less here, okay, because what we've essentially done is we've kept employees who would have left. However, we can recognize that we can allow people to continue leaving if we start to trend towards having a surplus. Okay. We also can look at new external hires. Now, it takes a while to hire people. Our ability to change later is a little bit lower because we've now brought people into the organization. Or we can look at technological innovations. So some of the things we talked about, like automation and self-checkout systems and things like that. Okay. Now, our ability to change later with these is a little bit lower too because we've invested in the technology. We've brought it in-house. It's not like we can unpay for the technology, so to speak. Now, we've talked about strategic planning within the context of trying to avoid a labor shortage or trying to avoid a labor surplus. And as we engage in this strategic planning, we need to make sure that we're recognizing the importance of core competencies. And core competencies are the knowledge and skills that our employees bring that make our organization superior to competitors and help to create value for our customers. And this is critical to the strategic planning process because as we're looking to avoid a labor surplus, if we are downsizing, we need to make sure that we're not cutting employees who have core competencies that are contributing to our competitive advantage. Okay, if we're hiring to avoid a labor shortage, we want to make sure that we're hiring employees who are going to bring core competencies to our organization and contribute to that competitive advantage. All too often, organizations will either look to hire quickly or they'll look to downsize quickly, and they won't really pay attention to the core competencies. They won't really pay attention to the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the specific employees who are being impacted by their actions. And their strategic plans are far less effective than they could be because of this omission. Now, as we move forward to the stage where we implement and evaluate the HR plan, we need to have a person who's accountable for achieving goals. And this person needs to have the authority and resources necessary to effectively implement the plan, and they should be issuing regular progress reports so that as an organization we understand how the plan is progressing. All right. We want to make sure that our planning and recruiting efforts are tied to the organization's strategy and tied to our employee development goals. And we also want to make sure that we're able to identify which parts of the process are working and which parts of the process aren't working for our organization. Now, as we implement our staffing plan, we're probably going to engage in recruiting. And recruiting basically involves identifying and attracting potential employees so that we always have a supply of people who we can hire when we need them. Okay, now as we talk about recruiting, we're going to break down three different aspects. We're going to talk about personnel policies, then we're going to talk about recruitment sources, and then finally we'll talk about recruiter traits and behaviors. Now, our personnel policies basically deal with how we're going to implement different human resource management practices. Okay, and these policies can play an important role in recruiting. And one that plays a really important role in recruiting is policies pertaining to internal versus external recruiting. Okay, now what that means is, are we hiring from within the organization or are we hiring people from outside the organization? With entry level positions, we pretty much almost always have to use external recruiting. Okay, because somebody is not going to start at the very bottom rung of the ladder unless we're bringing them into the company. Okay, but for management positions and positions that may be deemed higher level within the organization, we have to decide, are we promoting from within or are we hiring from the outside? Now, if you have a policy that you promote from within, that can be very attractive to candidates. Okay, the first real job that I had after college was with a company that promoted from within. So I got hired into basically an entry level position, but I knew that I had the opportunity to advance because I knew that I would be competing only with people within the company. I wouldn't be competing with people from outside of the company. That was very attractive to me as an applicant for an entry level position. Okay, now the downside to these types of policies where we promote from within is that we may pass up some very good external candidates for management positions down the line. Okay, another important policy to consider is how we're going to pay our people. And some organizations use what we call a lead the market pay strategy. Okay, and this basically means we're going to pay a little more than our competitors do because we want to ensure that we're bringing in the best talent. Okay, leading the market in terms of pay can be very attractive to job candidates. Another important policy decision to consider is whether your organization is going to engage in employment at will or you're going to have a due process policy. Now, if you're employment at will, basically the employer or the employee can end the relationship at any point in time. Okay, so the employer can fire the employee without cause, the employee can quit without notice. We basically agree that either one of us can end this at any point in time. Now, what that does for the employer is it gives them a lot of freedom in the decisions that they're going to make, but it also creates a perception that there is a lack of job security, and that may not be very appealing to candidates out there. What a due process policy does is it basically lays out steps so that an employee knows what things they could be terminated for and how they could potentially appeal a termination. And a due process policy could give applicants a little more of a perception of job stability. Now, these policies that we've talked about and other personnel policies will contribute to your organization's social presence and reputation. And reputation is going to play an important role in how people view your company and whether or not they're attracted to your company. So, for example, Zappos is a company with a reputation for having a very great organizational culture. Okay, people are known for having fun at Zappos, for being a little weird at Zappos, and a lot of people are drawn to wanting to work at Zappos because of this culture. Gravity Payments is known for paying its employees well, okay, for having a very high minimum wage for employees, and people are drawn to the company because of that. Even in the Great Resignation, Gravity has more applicants than they can hire. Okay, if your organization is known for being a good place to work for, you might be named to Fortune's 100 best companies to work for, and that kind of validates what your organization's culture is all about. Okay, it kind of tells applicants this is a really great place to go. And even if you're not on one of these lists, there are a lot of different job boards out there like Glassdoor and things of that nature where people are evaluating employers and letting others know what to expect if they work for a company. And all these components are going to contribute to your public reputation and contribute to your ability to recruit. So now that we've talked about our personnel policies and how they're going to influence our attractiveness to job applicants, let's talk about where we can recruit applicants from. So first we're going to talk about recruiting internally or recruiting within our organization. And when we recruit within the organization, we can post our jobs on company bulletin boards and employee publications and on our corporate intranet sites. Okay, it tends to be very inexpensive to recruit internally because we don't have to pay a lot of money to recruit outside in the marketplace. Okay, so that's one advantage of recruiting internally. Applicants are also very knowledgeable about the position. All right, they know really what to expect, what they're getting into. So we have a pretty good retention rate once we hire somebody internally into a position. Okay, and generally the applicants are also well known to the organization. So we know whether or not people are going to be a good fit for the position that they applied for. Now, if we're looking to hire people from outside of our organization, there are a variety of different places that we can turn as recruiting sources. Okay, so we may start with direct applicants or people who just look up our website or ask for a job application. Okay, but basically people who sought out our organization and applied directly to us. We may also get referrals. Now, referrals take place when someone who works within the organization encourages someone from outside of the organization to apply for a position. All right. We'll also look at job search and networking platforms. So we'll look at places where people on the job market network with each other. And these platforms also will be places, kind of like Indeed and LinkedIn and ZipRecruiter where employers can post jobs and people can post resumes and we can look to find matches and we can use different filtering criteria to find each other. All right, there's also help wanted advertising, and we might think of these as online job boards, but the truth is a lot of these online job boards have started transitioning into different types of job search and networking platforms. Okay, so we're seeing a lot less in terms of pure help wanted advertising. You may still see some help wanted advertising in the newspapers and whatnot, but that's really not as effective as the online job search and networking platforms. Okay, we'll also look at public and private employment agencies, so companies that we hire to help us fill positions. Okay, and these are really common with executive positions that are often called headhunting firms. And the reason that they're common with executive positions is it can be really challenging to find people who are willing to apply for high-level positions because they may not want their current employer to know that they're considering other jobs. So some of these employment agencies kind of specialize in finding candidates discreetly. And then finally, we have colleges and universities, and this is just when basically recruiters will go out to colleges and universities, look for people who are graduating soon who might fit the criteria of what the organization is looking for, and encourage them to apply for a job at the organization. So now that we've talked about recruiting sources, you might be wondering what the most effective recruiting sources are. Well, according to employers, the top recruiting source is actually referrals by other employees. Okay, and this might seem great because it might seem like a fairly inexpensive way of finding employees, but I wonder, what might be some of the problems with referrals? Well, if you think about it, people tend to have fairly homogeneous social circles. Okay, people tend to hang with people who they went to school with, or people they grew up with, or people who have similar backgrounds to them. So as employers, if we're relying on referrals by employees for all of our recruiting or for the majority of our recruiting, we may be limiting the potential diversity of our applicant pool. Now, as we consider the quality of recruitment sources, we're going to want to think about how are we going to evaluate different sources. And one way we can do this is with something called a yield ratio. And a yield ratio measures the percentage of applicants who move from one stage of the recruitment and selection process to the next. Okay, and basically what we can do is we can kind of compare these values to evaluate what the most efficient recruitment sources are. Okay, so over here on the right, you can see a table, and we can look at in stage one, we had 200 resumes generated, and we had 175 interview offers accepted. So if we divide 175 by 200, that's going to give us a yield ratio of 87%. Now at the next stage, we have 100 applicants who are judged acceptable. Now this is 100 out of the 175 who accepted offers. If we divide 100 by 175, that gives us a yield ratio of 57%. Okay, now in the next stage, we had 90 who accepted employment offers. Okay, and that's 90 out of the 100 who were judged acceptable previously. Okay, so if we divide 90 by 100, that gives us a yield ratio at that stage of 90%. Okay, and if we want to look at our cumulative yield ratio, what we're going to do is we're going to take that 90, which is how many accepted employment offers we had, and we're going to divide that 90 by 200, which is our resumes generated in the very beginning, and we're going to see that we have a cumulative yield ratio of 45% in this example. We can also consider efficiency in terms of cost per hire. Okay, and basically what we're looking at with cost per hire is how many people did we hire and how much did it cost us to hire them, so how much did it cost us per person. Okay, so if we go back to the same example that we were using before, all right, we had 90 accepted employment offers. That means we hired 90 people. Okay, and it cost us $30,000 to do that. So we take 30,000 and we divide that by 90, and that gives us a cost per hire of $333. In other words, we spent $333 for each person that we hired. Now, once we've calculated the yield ratio and the cost per hire for our sources, we can actually compare the efficiency of different recruitment sources. Okay, now if we take a look over here on the left at the local university, this is the column that we used on the previous two slides, and you'll see that the cost per hire there of $333 is lower than the cost per hire that we saw for any of the other sources in this bottom row. Okay, so the local university was the most efficient source in terms of cost per hire. Okay, but it wasn't necessarily the most efficient if we're looking at the cumulative yield ratio, okay, because we had a cumulative yield ratio here of 45%, and that's lower than two of our other ratios, the employee referrals and the executive search firms. Now, if we look at the executive search firms, had the highest cumulative yield ratio at 75%. Okay, so executive search firms were the most efficient in terms of cumulative yield ratio. But if we take a look at the cost per hire for executive search firms, that was $6,000. That was actually the most expensive cost per hire that we had. So this might not be the most efficient in terms of overall. All right, if we're looking for the most efficient overall, we might go over here and take a look at the employee referrals. And the reason we might look at employee referrals here is because the cumulative yield ratio was 70%, which is just a little bit lower than the executive search firms. Okay, and the cost per hire was $428, which is just a little bit higher than the local university. Okay, so we had a pretty low cost per hire here and a pretty high cumulative yield ratio, making employee referrals look like a fairly efficient recruiting source in this example. Finally, we're going to talk about the importance of your recruiter. Now, the recruiter is not as important as your personnel policies, but they can still make a pretty strong impact. Okay, applicants respond favorably to warm, informative recruiters. Okay, and they also appreciate getting a realistic job preview. Okay, and a realistic job preview really is just going to tell you both sides of the job. It's going to tell you the positives and the negatives so that you're prepared for what's to come. Okay, if a recruiter is too positive and doesn't share many negatives about a position, people can actually be a little bit suspicious about that job. So the realistic job preview can help in that manner. Now, while we did say that the personnel policies are more important than the recruiter can play a very important role in whether or not people accept employment offers, particularly when the recruiter does something negative. We're going to talk about that on the next slide. Now, as we said, recruiter behaviors, particularly if they're negative, can impact an employee's start with the company, or they can impact whether or not an applicant takes a job with the company. So I'm going to walk you through two different examples that talk about both of those types of situations. And the first one is one that I like to call Sports Week. Okay, so I'd started working with a company, and when they were recruiting me, they told me I was going to have to go away for training for a week. And when I asked them where I'd have to go, they said I could go anywhere I wanted to, and they gave me a list of cities. It was like 5 cities, and one of the cities was Chicago. And my little sister lived in Chicago, so I thought, you know what, this is a great idea here. It's a great opportunity to go visit her, so this is going to be great. So they gave me the dates that I would be going to Chicago. I gave them to my sister. She went out and she bought a whole bunch of tickets. She bought tickets to a hockey game, tickets to a Knicks Bulls game. She had the whole week lined up for things we were going to do after training. Okay, so she had gone out, spent all this money, and then I started working for the company, and then they changed the plan and decided they were going to send me to New Jersey. Okay, so that really got me off to a very bad start with that company, and I ended up really not staying there too long. All right. The next example is one I call the hotel lobby, where I had been flown across the country to interview somewhere, and I was staying in a hotel, and they were supposed to pick me up at 8 o'clock in the morning to start my days of interviews. And I had gotten up, I'd worked out, I'd eaten breakfast, I was ready to go, I was down in the lobby, and the person who was supposed to pick me up forgot. I sat there for over a half an hour before I finally called someone because, you know, it's kind of a touchy situation when they forget you in the lobby. You don't really know how to call and say something like, hey, did somebody forget me? That's a tough way to make a first impression, right? So, you know, I ended up calling around 8:30. Somebody finally got me around 9. And I was late to every single interview I had that day. I had to keep explaining myself. It was just a really negative experience that kind of built off this whole idea that somebody just forgot me first thing in the morning. And ultimately, you know, I was able to do a really good job in the interviews and they made me an offer. But as I weighed the offer, that was one of the factors that weighed into me deciding to decline the job offer. That's it for our lesson on planning for and recruiting human resources. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. This is Billy Obenauer signing off saying I'll talk to you soon.